Hi everyone, we are starting with a very important topic to deal with sources of business finance. We are going to talk about the shares, different types of shares, who are shareholders, equity shares, preference shares, everything. Now, when we divide the funds of the company into equal unit value, it is known as what? Nothing else but shares. And the people who actually own these shares in the company are known as shareholders. Own these shares means they contribute this money. Like I've taken here company X out here, and suppose there are people who are contributing this money out here. Suppose in this X's company, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people are contributing the money. Let's say A, B, C, D, and here we have E. Now, they all are contributing money. They are contributing 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10 rupees each. All of them in company of X, where X has his own capital of somewhere around, let's suppose he has a capital of 40 rupees. The 50 rupees is given by the other 5 people. That makes it 90 rupees in the company, and he wants to start a company with 100 rupees. Still needs 10 rupees. These 10 he can raise from borrowing or from other sources, but till now he has the ownership of his own money 40 rupees and different 5 people contributing 10 rupees each. These 10 people, 10 rupees people who are contributing 10 rupees, they are the owners with him in the company. All of them will get the returns as dividend as per the contribution made by them. This contribution in totality will make the total capital of the company. Let's come to shares. The capital of a company is divided into equal unit value or small unit. It is called shares. What is share capital? The capital obtained by issue of shares is known as share capital. The different types of shares are equity and preference. And what is equity capital? The money raised by issue of equity share capital is known as equity share capital. And preference share capital, what is preference share capital? Money raised by issue of preference share capital. It's like something very important, that money raised by equity shares is known as equity share capital, or preference shares is known as preference share capital. Well, jokingly, we will not be discussing about preference shares capital out here. Why? Because that I'll discuss when I'll do that topic. Right now we're talking about the equity shareholders. Equity shareholders are the owners of the company. This type of capital is there in the company for a very long time. It is owners fund, and the people bear the risk and reward both, and they have the limited liability up to the extent of capital contributed by them. Then also when we talk about the equity shareholders, they are the residual claimants. They are the people who receive the dividend at last. Why? Because if company gets profit, first of all, company pays to the creditors or the debenture holders, or to whom they have to pay. Once they are paid, then whatever is left over is paid to the equity shareholders after taking out the tax, of course, after deducting the tax. So that is why the equity shareholders are called the residual claimants. One. Second thing, the major thing about the equity shareholders is, since they bear the risk reward, they have the right to vote, right to control, right to manage the company, and this money is not to be paid back. It's a permanent source of finance into the company forever, or till the company exists is the right word. Let's hear about the features of equity shares. It is most important source of raising long-term capital by the company. One, equity share represent the ownership of a company. Yes, equity shares actually make you the owner of the company. Capital raised by issue of such shares is known as ownership capital or owner's fund. So if you get a question, what are owner's fund? What is owner's fund? It is the capital raised by issue of the equity shares. Equity share capital is a prerequisite to the creation of the company. Why? Because you need your money first, and then you need money from these 5 people, and then only can you start the company. So he wanted, if X wanted 100 rupees, 40 was his own, 50 he got as equity shareholders, 10 rupees contributed by different people. You'd say, ma'am, these 50 they are contributing, it will become their company, not X's company. No, it is not like that, because these people are from different places and they're just contributing 10 rupees each. So major contribution is of X 40, and then 10 from A, 10 from B, 10 from C, 10 from D, and so on. So when we talk about the prerequisite, that is equity share capital is prerequisite to the creation of the company. Very true. Why? Because we are talking about this money which has been given by the shareholders as well as by the X to his company. Equity shareholders get fluctuating dividend. Why? Because the dividend is depends upon the profit. So whatever the profit is, in case the profit increases, the dividend increases. Otherwise, they may not get the dividend at all, or may get less dividend. Now, they are referred to as residual claimants. Why they are referred to as residual claimants? Why? Because first we pay off to the debenture holders or those who have given the money, or the company has borrowed from. So they pay off the creditors, the lenders, and then we talk about the debenture holders. Then we talk about the paying of the taxes, and then the leftover is given as dividend to the equity shareholders. That's why they are known as residual claimants. So I usually term them as that they get whatever is left over. They enjoy the reward as well as bear the risk of ownership. Of course, if they are the owners, they have to take up the reward in terms of profit, and in case there are losses, they get no dividend at all. So that also they have to bear. They have limited liability. Of course, yes, they have the liability to the extent of capital contributed by them. And if you remember, we studied about the company form of organization. We studied this very clearly, that the company, the owner, the company, when we talk about, has a separate legal entity from that of the owner. So they have limited liability to extent to the capital contributed by them. They have right to vote. They have right to participate or control in the company. That is why they are known as the owners of the company, the equity shareholders. Why are equity shareholders called residual claimants? Now, equity shareholders are called the residual claimants as they receive what is left after all other claims on the company's income and assets have been settled. So this is about the introduction to equity share and equity shareholders. Next we come to is merits and limitations of equity shares. Going to the merit of equity shares. The first merit says equity shares are suitable for investors who are willing to assume higher risk at higher returns. Yes, they are always risk ready, and they also get higher returns. Why? Whenever you employ debt along with equity, the residual claimants always get more return in comparison to anyone else. Why? Because debenture holders take fixed rate of interest. Whatever is left over for equity shareholders is always higher. Next, payment of dividend to the equity shareholders is not compulsory. Why? Because in case the company does not have any profit, it will not pay any dividend to the equity shareholders. It has the compulsion of paying to the debenture holders. It has the compulsion of paying to the preference shareholders, which is a fixed dividend, but to equity shareholders, no compulsion is there. So, one, it is fluctuating return. Second, it is fluctuating along with not compulsory. So that comes out as a benefit to the company. So this is from the point of view of the company. Equity capital serves as a permanent capital, as it is to be repaid only at the time of liquidation of company. When we wind up the company, then only we pay back to the equity shareholders. Equity capital provides creditworthiness to the company and confidence to prospective loan providers. Yes, it does. Why? Because if you have more equity capital, then in that case, and you borrow lesser, then in that case the creditworthiness of the company is very high, and those who see the reputation of the company on a higher side are ready to lend money to it in the long run. Funds can be raised through equity issue without creating any charge on the assets of the company. You don't need to mortgage anything at all. So the assets are free for any other purpose. You can put them put the assets for borrowing from some other financial institution or commercial banks or wherever. Democratic control over the management of the company is assured due to voting rights of the equity shareholders. All equity shareholders have voting rights irrespective of whatever the contribution is there. Yes, according to that, things become more easier to control and manage. Going to the demerits, investors who want steady income not prefer equity shares, as equity shares get fluctuating returns. For company, it's good. When they don't have money, they don't have to pay. But for the equity shareholders, not a good idea. They don't enjoy it. If they're not getting returns, why would they enjoy it? They won't. The cost of equity share is generally more as compared to cost of raising funds through other sources. Very true. Sometimes what happens is that the cost of equity shares in terms of underwriters fee or issuing of prospectus or printing of prospectus or some other kind of expenses is more. So that way equity turns out to be expensive source for the company. Issue of additional equity share dilutes the voting power and earnings of existing shareholders. Very true. Sometimes what happens, if you remember the company X, where X had contributed 40 and other people ABCD had contributed 10 each, and that made it 90 rupees. Now sometimes X company might need the excess company might need some more additional equity. In that case, they may go in the market and ask for the additional equity. Now they may not get the additional equity until unless the outside equity shareholders want to pool more than what is already there with the insiders. And in that case, what happens is the existing shareholders equity is watered. It's called watering the equity, and the control is diluted. It goes into the hands of the outsider. So it is said, whenever outside equity shareholders have more share than inside equity shareholders, it leads to dilution of control. More formalities and procedural delays are involved while raising funds through issue of equity shares. Very true, very right. If you remember your chapter 7, how strenuous the process of raising funds through equity share is and what all documents you have to prepare. So undoubtedly procedural delays are involved for the company. We've done with the video of equity shares. Next we are going to talk about is preference shares. Hi. We just winded off with equity shares. Now you're well read with equity shares. Let's start with preference shares. What are preference shares? Preference share or preference share capital is the money raised through preference shares. Why are preference shares called so? Preference shares are called so because the preference shareholders have preferential rights over the equity shareholder. First, they get dividend before the equity shareholders get, and second, at the time of the liquidation of the company, preference shareholders are paid before the equity shareholders get the money. Like at the time of winding of the company, first we pay to the debenture holders and the creditors and everybody who has to take money, then preference shareholders get, and then the equity shareholders get. Similarly, at the time of receiving dividend, first you will pay off all the people, bear all the expenses, pay taxes, and then leftover dividend is given to first to equity to the preference shareholders, and then at last to the equity shareholders. So these are the two preferential rights of preference share capital. Preference share capital is also known as hybrid securities because they resemble debentures as well as equity. They resemble debenture because they get a fixed rate, but not of interest but of dividend. They resemble equity. Why? Because they are getting dividend like the equity shareholders get the dividend in the company. So let's quickly read through. Preference shares. The capital raised by issue of preference shares is called preference share capital. The preference shareholders enjoy a preferential position over equity shareholders in two ways. They receive a fixed rate of dividend out of the net profits of the company before any dividend is declared for equity shareholders. Just now explain the same thing to you. Receiving their capital after claims of the company creditors have been paid settled at the time of liquidation. That's the second point. That's why they have preferential right over the equity shareholders. Next question is, why are preference shares called hybrid securities? Preference shares are called hybrid securities because they resemble debentures as they bear fixed rate of return. The dividend is payable only at the discretion of the directors and only out of the profits after tax. So they resemble equity shares because they get fixed rate of return. Debentures, they get dividend. So the equity shares. Now, there's another point about preference shares, that the preference shareholders have no right to vote, no right to control in the company except for equity shareholders. None of the other people have right to vote or control over the company. Next topic we're going to discuss in the preference shares is the types of preference shares. Cumulative preference shares, non-cumulative, participating, non-participating. Starting with the cumulative preference shares. The preference shares which enjoy the right to accumulate unpaid dividend in the future years in case same is not paid during a year. Suppose this year you don't get a dividend, right? So what will happen? Your dividend can get accumulated and be paid later on. So that's called cumulative. Cumulative means to get it together. Maybe later years you get the dividend together. Next is non-cumulative. Dividend is not accumulated if it is not paid in a particular year. So where it is not accumulated is known as non-accumulative dividend. Next is participating. Preference shares which have a right to participate in the further surplus of the company. Shares are which after dividend at a certain rate has been paid on equity shares. What happens is you pay to the creditors, you pay to the debenture holders, you pay to the preference shareholders, and then you pay to the equity shareholders, and still dividend is left and you pay to the preference shareholders, that is participating preference shareholders. That's how they're known as participating. Next is non-participating are such which do not enjoy such rights of participation in the profit of the company are called non-participating. That means once they receive dividend, it's over and out. After equity shareholders get whatever is left over is with the company to be kept as reserves or surplus. So we've just finished off with cumulative, non-cumulative, participative, non-participating preference shares. Next we come to is convertible, non-convertible, merits and demerits of preference shares. Coming to the next difference of preference shares, we have convertible and non-convertible, which the convertible preference shares are those which can be easily converted into equity shares after a specified period of time, and non-convertible are those which cannot be converted into the equity shares. Preference shares are those that can be converted into equity shares within a specified period of time are known as convertible preference shares. Non-convertible are such that cannot be converted to equity shares. Next we come to is merits of preference shares. Preference shares provide reasonable steady income in form of fixed rate of return and safety of investment. Your investment is safe. Why? Because you're getting fixed rate of dividend. Your money will not get the money will not go a waste if you have invested in preference shares. Like for example, if you sometimes what happens is people when they invest in equity shares, they have this risk that they may not get their returns, but here the investment is safe. Preference shares are useful for those investors who want fixed rate of return with lower risk. Yes, they are not risk bearers and they get a fixed rate of dividend that we know very clearly. It does not affect the control of equity shareholders because they do not have right to vote and right to control over the management, as preference shareholders don't have voting rights. So they don't have any kind of voting rights. Payment of fixed rate of dividend to preference shares may enable a company to declare higher rates of dividend for the equity share in good times. Very true. Please listen carefully. When there are good times and we pay a fixed dividend to preference shareholders or fixed rate of interest to debenture holders, whatever comes out as leftover for equity shareholders is usually more. So more dividend is declared for the equity shareholders, beneficiary to them. Preference shareholders have a preferential right over repayment, of course, over equity shareholders. So even at the time of liquidation of the company, preference shareholders are paid before the equity shareholders in the event of liquidation of company. Preference capital does not create any charge against the assets of the company. No mortgage, is as simple as that. So you don't have to mortgage anything, you don't have to keep anything as security. Next we do is limitation. Alright, next you come to is demerits of preference shares. Preference shares are not suitable for those investors who are willing to take risk and are interested in high returns. So those shareholders who want returns and are actually can bear the risk are the people who do not prefer preference shares. Why? They prefer equity. So in that case, the company may not get enough of preference shareholders. Preference shares capital dilutes the claim of equity shareholders over the assets of the company. Yes. So at the time of winding up of the company, since preference shareholders get before the equity shareholders, from the point of view of the equity shareholders, this is not a very good idea because equity shareholders are the owners of the company and they are not getting the preference of getting any recovery of losses or at the time of liquidation of the company, the preference shareholders are getting a preferential right, and who are not even the owners of the company, who do not have right to vote, right to participate. So from that point of view, the rate of dividend on preference shares is generally higher than the rate of interest on debentures. Yes, though there is fixed rate of interest on debentures, but that fixed rate of interest on debentures is comparatively lesser because dividend usually is higher, and for preference dividend, the dividend goes much higher, and at that time it becomes a limitation when compared to debentures. Alright, next point. As the dividends on the preference shares is to be paid when company earns profit, there is no assured return for the investors. If company doesn't get profit, no returns. As simple as that. The dividend paid is not deductible from profits as expense, thus there is no tax saving as in case of interest on loans. See, get it very clear. Whenever we pay interest on debentures or interest on loans, they are treated as expense in the P&L account, which reduces our net profit, and the tax liability becomes lesser. Because interest is a tax deductible expense, so tax liability becomes lesser. Dividend, it is not treated as an expense in the P&L account, so this creates a problem for the company, so it becomes a limitation. That's all with the limitations of preference shares. We'll be discussing the debentures in the next video. Till then, bye bye.